November 27, 1950, North Korea, the thermometer reads 30 degrees below zero. Around 30,000 United Nations troops, mostly U.S. Marines and Army soldiers, suddenly find themselves completely surrounded by approximately 120,000 Chinese forces in the frozen mountains near the Chosin Reservoir. Outnumbered 4 to 1, facing sub-zero temperatures, and cut off from reinforcements, they have two choices: surrender or fight their way out. What happens next becomes one of the most legendary battles in American military history. Just months earlier, the Korean War looked like it was almost over. After the successful Incheon landing in September 1950, UN forces under General Douglas MacArthur pushed deep into North Korea, racing toward the Chinese border. MacArthur was confident. He believed the war would be over by Christmas. American troops were winning, pushing north, and the end seemed in sight. But MacArthur had made a catastrophic miscalculation. What U.S. intelligence didn't fully grasp was that China had been secretly moving massive forces across the Yalu River into North Korea. By late November, the People's Volunteer Army had infiltrated the region with over 150,000 troops. The Chinese weren't just defending their border, they were setting a trap. The 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General Oliver P. Smith, advanced toward the Chosin Reservoir along with elements of the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division. The terrain was brutal, a mountainous region accessed by a single narrow dirt road that twisted through mountain passes. Smith was cautious. He had concerns about how far his division was being stretched, so as they advanced, he deliberately slowed the march to establish supply depots and build emergency airstrips at key locations like Heigaru-ri and Kotori. His superiors criticized him for being too slow, too careful. That caution would save thousands of lives. Then, on November 14th, a massive cold front from Siberia descended on the region. Temperatures plummeted to as low as 36 degrees below zero. The cold became as deadly as any enemy. Weapons froze, blood plasma froze solid, and became useless. Morphine syrettes had to be thawed in medics' mouths before they could be injected. Batteries died in minutes. The oil in machine guns turned to gel, causing them to jam. Marines couldn't dig foxholes because the ground was frozen solid like concrete. They had to use explosives just to make shallow defensive positions. And then the Chinese attacked. On the night of November 27th, Chinese forces launched massive coordinated assaults on UN positions around the reservoir. At Udamni, on the western side of the reservoir, two Marine regiments came under heavy attack. On the eastern side, Army Task Force McLean was hit even harder and quickly surrounded. At Heigaru-ri, the main supply base, Chinese troops surged toward the unfinished airfield. The attacks came in waves, thousands of Chinese soldiers moving through the darkness, blowing bugles and horns to create chaos and fear. The fighting was brutal and close. Marines and soldiers fought hand to hand in some positions. One Marine, Private First Class Hector Caparata, stood his ground for hours at a position called Fox Hill, throwing back Chinese grenades and firing until his rifle barrel glowed red hot. He was wounded multiple times but refused to leave his position. He would later receive the Medal of Honor. The Marines suffered hundreds of casualties that first night. So did the Chinese, who lost nearly 10,000 men in the initial assaults, many freezing to death in the extreme cold. The Chinese forces lacked proper winter clothing and adequate supplies. Some wore nothing more than quilted cotton uniforms. Thousands would die from exposure alone. By November 28th, the UN forces at Chosin were completely surrounded and cut off. The Chinese had blocked the main road south. Units were isolated from each other. Casualties were mounting. The wounded were laid outside on the frozen ground because the aid stations were overwhelmed. Men fell asleep standing up from exhaustion. Some Marines were so tired they had to physically hold each other upright. General Smith faced an impossible situation. His division was scattered across 78 miles of mountainous terrain, surrounded by a numerically superior enemy in the worst winter conditions imaginable. When a reporter asked if the Marines were retreating, Smith gave a response that would become legendary. He said, "Retreat, hell, we're just attacking in another direction." It wasn't just bravado, it was tactical reality. The Marines couldn't just retreat, they had to fight their way out, securing each position, each hill, each mile of road as they moved. And Smith made a decision that defined the Marine Corps ethos. They would bring out every wounded Marine, every piece of equipment they could carry, and every single one of their dead. No one would be left behind. On December 1st, after desperate fighting to secure the airfield at Hagaruri, transport planes began landing on the rough, partially completed runway to evacuate the most seriously wounded and bring in desperately needed supplies and ammunition. Over the next several days, C-47 aircraft would evacuate thousands of casualties despite the primitive conditions and constant enemy fire. On December the 6th, the breakout began in earnest. The 7th Marine Regiment led the advance south from Hagaruri toward Kotori, fighting through an area that would become known as Hellfire Valley. Every mile was contested. The Chinese attacked from the high ground on both sides of the road. The column moved slowly, fighting off ambushes, clearing roadblocks, rescuing isolated units. Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, one of the most decorated Marines in history, commanded the 1st Marine Regiment holding the southern positions. When told they were surrounded, Puller reportedly said, "They're on our left, they're on our right, they're in front of us, they're behind us. They can't get away this time." His defiance became another rallying cry for the exhausted Marines. The road south led through the Funchal Pass, a treacherous section where a critical bridge had been destroyed by the Chinese. Engineers had to build a replacement span using sections airdropped by parachute, all while under enemy fire in sub-zero temperatures. On December 9th, the convoy crossed the makeshift bridge and continued toward the coast. The fighting didn't stop. The Chinese pursued, launching attacks along the entire route. U.S. Navy and Marine Corps aircraft provided crucial air support, dropping napalm and strafing Chinese positions. Air Force cargo planes dropped over 200 tons of supplies per day to the moving column. Close air support was so effective that it inflicted massive casualties on the pursuing Chinese forces and prevented them from overwhelming the retreating UN troops. On December 11, 1950, the lead elements of the 1st Marine Division reached the port of Hungnam. Over the next several days, 193 ships evacuated the entire X-Corps, more than 100,000 military personnel, along with thousands of tons of equipment and supplies, and over 91,000 Korean refugees fleeing the Chinese advance. It was the largest amphibious evacuation in U.S. military history. The cost was staggering. The 1st Marine Division reported approximately 750 killed in action, over 3,000 wounded, and more than 7,000 non-battle casualties, mostly from frostbite. Some units lost over a third of their strength. Many Marines lost fingers, toes, or entire limbs to the cold. 8,000 men suffered severe frostbite injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. But the Chinese suffered far worse. Official Chinese records report over 52,000 casualties in the Ninth Corps alone, including more than 30,000 from non-combat causes like frostbite and starvation. Some estimates put total Chinese losses as high as 60,000. The Chinese Ninth Corps was rendered combat ineffective for 3 months and had to be completely reconstituted. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir was not a victory in the traditional sense. The UN forces had to abandon North Korea and withdraw south. The war would continue for 2.5 more years, but militarily it was an extraordinary achievement. An entire division, surrounded and outnumbered, had fought its way out of an impossible situation and destroyed a significantly larger enemy force in the process. 17 medals of honor were awarded for actions at Chosin Reservoir, along with 78 Service Cross medals. The 1st Marine Division received the Presidential Unit Citation. For their actions in that frozen hell, the survivors earned a title they carry with pride to this day, the Chosin Few. The battle proved something fundamental about human endurance and military discipline. In the words of one survivor, some men freeze to death at 0, others refuse to die at 40 below. The Marines and soldiers at Chosin chose not to die. They chose to fight, and in doing so, they created a legend that will endure as long as America remembers its warriors. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed learning something new today, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment telling us what you thought of this story.